Over to you, Kristina.
Hello, thank you. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for the Caribbean Geography Specialty Group presentation. It's a part of a series called Tracing the Contours of the Caribbean Geography. And today we'll be focusing on disaster, post-colonial crisis, and ecologies of repair. We have two amazing panelists with us today, Dr. Felima and Dr. Perry, and I will start by, as well as the chair of the Caribbean Geography Specialty Group, Dr. Marion Werner. So before we begin and I introduce the panelists, I'm going to ask Dr. Werner to give some opening remarks and welcome from the Specialty Group Board. Dr. Werner.
Hello, thank you so much. Welcome. Very excited to hear from Keston and Crystal. I know both your work, so this is going to be great. Just to let you know, the specialty group is organizing a panel for AAG, so please stay tuned to our CFP, which is a little bit late, but it's going to come out. It's going to be great. And if you're organizing any other AAG activities, virtual or in person, please do get in touch with me for specialty group sponsorship. And I think that's it. With that, I'll turn it back over to Kristina.
Thank you. So as I mentioned before, this is a part of the series. And today we're focusing on disasters, post-colonial crisis, and ecologies of repair. I'm going to start by giving a brief bio on Dr. Felima. Dr. Felima is an assistant professor of anthropology and African American and Africana studies at the University of Kentucky. She earned her PhD in anthropology with graduate certifications in disaster and emergency management and Latin American studies from the University of Florida. Her research centers on individual narratives and collective storytelling to explore the intersections of structural inequalities and racial capitalism and climate change in peripheral communities in the Caribbean, with a specific focus on Haiti. Dr. Felima teaches African anthropology courses on racial ecologies, disasters, and human rights. Through a Black feminist lens, she's working on her first book project on local food experiences and differential vulnerabilities in Haiti. Prior to joining academia, Felima served as an emergency management specialist, geospatial analyst, and equity advisor at the Federal Emergency Management Agency in Washington, D.C. As a transdisciplinary scholar and applied anthropologist, Felima actively collaborates across various disciplines and fields. She's a co-principal investigator on a recently awarded National Institutes of Health project and is partnering with colleagues in UKY College of Medicine on environmental health initiative in Eastern Ohio. In addition to her research and teaching roles, Felima serves as a co-series editor for Burham Books' Catastrophes in Context series and is a board member of the Haitian Studies Association. I'm also going to introduce the other panelist, Dr. Perry. Dr. Perry is a political economist and assistant professor in the Department of African Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. He teaches courses on race, reparation, Caribbean economic history, and political economy, colonialism, and climate change, and global finance and governance. His research and scholarships examine roles of race as an economic ordering driver in the climate crisis and global financial arrangements and their implications on marginalized communities in the Caribbean region. He utilizes economic history, plantation economic theory, and critical analysis of economic data to unsettle narrow economic analyses about climate crisis. He further investigates how global financial and climate governance affects Caribbean societies in the context of intersecting economic and ecological crises. His work has been published in a number of international academic journals, including Geoforum, Geographic Journal, Development and Change, among others, as well as popular media outlets. He's currently working on a book on climate reparations, plantation imperialism, and the implications of cascading ecological and economic calamities for the notion of radical humanism. He has held academic appointments at the University of West England, UK, Tufts University, and most recently, Williams College, USA. So these are our two panelists, and I'm going to ask if the panelists would have anything they'd like to add before we start the questions and presentations. No? Dr. Perry, nothing you'd like to add? So would you like us to begin with the questions? Yes, okay. So the first question to both panelists would be, what brought you to geography? Could you describe your main work and main lines of research and what motivates you to do that work? Dr. Perry, I think your mic's open, so you have to start.
Okay. I was going to give Crystal the floor, but I'll go ahead. So actually, this is incidental, I would say. My relationship to geography is quite incidental because I think some of the theories and ideas in geography and Black geographies in particular and critical geography help, I think, for me, to emphasize and better reveal some of the challenges that Korean societies face. And I think I took some of that inspiration from George Beckford's book, who says, and I think in the introduction, he talks about, which is, the book is called On Persistent Poverty by George Beckford. He talks about, in order to understand Caribbean societies, we have to take a very interdisciplinary lens, and geography and human geography helped me to sort of understand and reveal some of those nuances in Caribbean societies.
And you, Dr. Felima, what brought you to geography?
Yeah, so with my research, I started to think about space and place in terms of my research site, which is in northern Haiti, in the city of Cap-Haïtien, the second largest city. And so I was thinking about kind of these spatial dimensions of risk and vulnerability and how these different local insights and experiences help me think about these different processes, these macro and micro processes that produce disasters, structural inequalities in Haiti. And so, I mean, I started thinking through space and place during my dissertation, but I didn't really realize that I was thinking through geography at the time. And so, thinking about my particular field site and looking at how there's a shaping of risk due to a particular geography in northern Haiti, I started thinking about how to incorporate more insights from geography. And so I also think about scale. So not just space and place, but also scale. Because I look at racial capitalism, neoliberal policies, and how those different structures, macro structures, inform the lived experiences in Haiti. And so for me, I'm always thinking about Haiti's global positionality. And so with that, I'm thinking about empire, I'm thinking about state governance. And so for me, I'm thinking through scale as well. And so my work goes in between, I'm very much a transdisciplinary scholar, but my work kind of goes between geographies, Black ecologies, small island disaster risk. And so for me, geography just helps me think more about vulnerability and risk. And so from like the academic perspective, but from the kind of career perspective, my applied anthropology work, as you stated, about me working for FEMA, I'm trained as an anthropologist. I didn't have any geography background, just thinking through geography. But when I was at FEMA, I was able to take some GIS courses for free, and I became a GIS specialist, with my work at FEMA. So it's been a really interesting way to think through, space, place, scale through my own work.
And you speak a lot about your work being focused on Haiti as well as small island developing states. Why do you think we should be talking about, or why do you think Caribbean geography is important?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think for me, Caribbean geography really allows us to think about how places and spaces and geographies expand, contract. They're shaped by governance, they're shaped by colonialization. And so I think about, resilience. If we're thinking about resilience as kind of this fluid concept, it's important for us to kind of think through, well, how do we kind of think about in pre-disaster states. I mean, in the case of Haiti, it's kind of to me, it's dangerous to think about resilience because that could be a way in people say like, oh, Haiti's resilient, then that means they can withstand everything, or, really have these different tropes about Haiti being, they're so resilient, they're superhuman, and they can kind of withstand all these different things. But, for me, I think geography's helped me kind of really interrogate these macro structures that help me think about these, smaller lived experiences and collective experience throughout Haiti.
Yeah, and Dr. Perry, I'm going to ask you because earlier you spoke about your work with Black geographies. What relationship do you see between governance, resilience, and colonialism, as well as historic and contemporary Caribbean geographies? Like, what is the relationship between these? I mean, within an academic space, people often, able to understand what's Black geography, critical race theory, but outside of academia, when you try to explain certain relationships to people, it also gets hard. So what relationship do you see between those different themes?
Thanks for those reflections, Crystal, because it also sort of helped me think through some of the questions that I ask, right, in my own work. And I'll come to your question. I mean, it's linked. I'm going to answer your question, Kristina. I think one of my motivations is that, and this is why I moved from an economics department, because I realized that some of the questions that I wanted to ask around reparatory justice, around climate reparations, around how Caribbean societies and places can answer really big theoretical and questions, right? And I mean, it sort of brought me back home. When I say home, in the sense that it brought me back to Caribbean scholars, right? Very early on in my doctoral work, I engaged with a lot of Caribbean scholarship and a lot of plantation economists and scholars who were writing about the plantation as a modern day configuration and assemblage of different kinds of spatial relationships. And, it made me start questioning some of the sort of epistemological concerns about in economics and economic thinking that were incapable of addressing the concerns that are very, very peculiar to the Caribbean. And one of the issues is that many people consider the Caribbean as too small to answer big questions, right? And to make, major reflections and major contributions to knowledge, right? And I think many of the plantation economists, Norman Gervan, whose work I draw upon, almost incessantly, right? Who's very, very critical to my own thinking about the Caribbean, helps us to really understand, right, that the Caribbean has always been very central to global processes, right? Global economic processes, global struggles, right? Global struggles for liberation, freedom, etc., what have you. We've always been central to questions of violence, questions of epistemic erasure, right? Questions of, reparations, very, very big questions that we ask in Black studies and ask in sort of cognate fields. The Caribbean can tell you a lot about those questions, right? And the relationship between and on a scale, scalar, when we're thinking about scale, we have to think about one, the Caribbean as place in relation to always things that are going on globally, right? In relation to things that are going on internationally. And this is what brought me to think about how do we relate and think about colonialism to questions of global finance, to questions of issues around, how multilateral lending institutions affect the life circumstances of Caribbean people and Caribbean communities, right? So, it is always the Caribbean as a space, as an archipelago, has always been central to major concerns, globally. And I think my relationship to the Caribbean is always to center how we understand place and how we understand these global processes affecting us, but more than that, how we affect those global processes, right? And it's very, very important for us to have that sort of relational understanding of the Caribbean.
Thank you for that. And I don't know if Dr. Felima wants to add anything to that question, or
No, I think we're good. Yeah.
and building along that line, we have been seeing, unfortunately, in the region, a lot more disasters happening, sometimes concurrently, sometimes in rapid succession. We remember what happened in 2017 with Irma Maria. We also remember Hurricane Matthew, Hurricane Dorian, and its impacts. We are also seeing an increasing trend of disaster capitalism in the region. But the challenge is oftentimes when we look at disaster capitalism in the region, they're looked at in silos. So either there's a focus on Puerto Rico or there's a focus on Barbuda. How important do you think is regional solidarity and comparative geographical analysis in responding to these challenges of disaster capitalism? I think I want to ask Dr. Felima to start.
Yeah, I mean, coalition building and those inter-regional partnerships among the Caribbean are really vital to think about risk, climate, weather-related disasters. Regionally, it helps us think more about climate network governance, leadership, collaboration. I'm just thinking through, how important it is for us to really tap into effective climate adaptation throughout the Caribbean. But that requires us to think collectively. That requires us to, not being, I guess, particular silos, whether that's based on language, right? Because, there may be some collaborations that happen throughout the Caribbean, but maybe not all the Caribbean states are part of that, maybe due to language. And so thinking of coalition building that is very inclusive and effective is important. I also think on the local scale to think through grassroots or efforts, whether it's youth organizations, women organizations, farmers, faith-based organizations. I think the synergies and the opportunities that these local organizations are doing can provide some additional understanding of climate action strategies. My work in Haiti, I've seen a variety of different organizations, particularly women farmers that I've worked with, who are having these really intentional conversations about flooding and how flooding impacts their families and, different ways in which they have opportunities to kind of think through vulnerability. They're thinking through risk, but they also need support, right? And they also need those partnerships with other people, in my opinion, throughout the Caribbean. So I think there has to be coalition building to kind of move that needle forward in terms of climate action, for sure.
For me, I think I have been thinking about the Caribbean, and as I write the book, I'm thinking about how various processes, both in the past and in the present, how they're connected to each other, right? Processes of capitalism, processes of colonialism, right? Processes of racial slavery, right? And these what are considered moments are conjunctural. They're connected to each other, right? And they create what what I'm calling racialized disaster zones, right? In the Caribbean, where the Caribbean has almost become synonymous with crisis. This question of crisis as a sort of liminal and sort of interminable kind of process in the region, right? From one crisis to the next, from structural adjustment, now we have climate crisis, right? So I think we have to think, when we think about disasters in the region, we have to think about them conjuncturally, right? It's not necessarily about these sort of disparate events happening that that are disconnected from each other, but rather disasters are interconnected, right? So from the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, right, to the kinds of financialization policies we've seen in terms of disaster management, right? And that is directly linked to your question about disaster capitalism that's happening. And that has always happened in the Caribbean, right? It's always somebody coming, often externally, but there's since independence, there have been, these internal actors that are trying to profit from what we might call disaster. And I wanted to sort of emphasize as well the kinds of politics that surround or respond to these kinds of disasters have always been crisis politics. Politics of crisis, because it's always in response to emancipation. So the liberation of enslaved Africans, right? There's been a politics associated with that, a crisis politics associated with that. In terms of climate crisis, there's been a crisis politics associated with responding to climate change, and one of the responses has been, the dispossession of African diasporic communities in the Caribbean. We've seen that going on in Barbuda, where the land, is being privatized, and there's a major case that is going to, I think coming up very soon, going to the Privy Council, about that particular privatization of land in Barbuda, right? So there's always been these external actors utilizing the Caribbean as test sites for these various kinds of capitalistic sort of imaginaries and products. And that has always been a politics of crisis, in my view, especially under the system of capitalism that we live in.
Yeah, and I think also it allows for us to be able to spot trends that weren't previously looked at, because I think a lot of the work sometimes, when you read something in Puerto Rico and then you read another paper that's coming out in Barbuda, or when you read something that's coming out in Haiti, we're able to see from these different detailed analysis trends in how these systems sort of move. And it would allow us to also, because a lot of the work that we do in academia is also to empower grassroots organizations and different communities on the ground. So it's to equip them with different skills to say, we know what these policies may or may not lead to, and we know different implications they may have. And Dr. Perry, you also mentioned about global financial systems and policies of crisis. Wow, can you elaborate on how global financial systems reproduce marginalization and dispossession in the Caribbean, more specifically loss and damage politics? Because that is something they talk about every year at COP.
Yeah, sure. In terms of global financial institutions, right? So some of my work reflect on some of the policies of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, right? Which have been two of the major institutions that have responded in times of crisis, let's call it that, right? As an ongoing, I think Hilda Lawrence talks about this as a turbulent ongoingness, right? Or Jovan Scott Lewis talks about it as an ordinariness of crisis in the region. After these sort of major events, these international financial institutions are sort of approached often by Caribbean governments for some form of support. And instead of sort of recognizing, one, the role that these institutions have played since the Second World War in contributing to the crisis of marginalization in the region, they offer loans, or they offer these kinds of financialized products, which in essence are meant to reward investors, bondholders, and people who have capital, basically, which and the Caribbean does not have capital, to respond to these major events for relief, for basic sort of infrastructure needs, for recovery strategies, and so on. These institutions are set up in the image and likeness, what I call the image and likeness of European humanism, right? As a way to further marginalize these institutions in increasing their debt burdens on the one hand, right? So if we talk about the fact that Hurricane Irma hit Antigua and Barbuda in 2017, in September 2017, and it was the day after that Antigua and Barbuda owed the IMF, I think I think $15 million in a debt repayment scheme, and the IMF did not decide to stop the payment. The IMF decided, hey, you all owed us money. You know, you've just been wiped off. The entire sort of Barbuda, the island had to be evacuated and so on. But you still owe us money, right? And, you know, that has happened since I think 2004 was the sort of very exemplary moment in Grenada in Hurricane Ivan, when you know, these kinds of catastrophic financial insurance policies and so on were introduced in the Caribbean as a means for global investors to capitalize on disaster in the region, as opposed to addressing the needs and the gaps in support that Caribbean communities require during these times. So these institutions have not really supported the Caribbean. They've contributed in many ways to human rights abuses, to, you know, further environmental degradation in terms of the kinds of policies that we've seen. I think Sarah Vaughan just wrote a book, Engineering Vulnerability. We see the role of the World Bank in Guyana, for instance. So they've not been very supportive of the Caribbean. They've been really supportive of global capital and global investors. And that has been a major challenge that continues to imperil many of the region's islands.
Right. And Dr. Perry just spoke about some of the economic structural factors that reproduce vulnerability within the region. Dr. Felima, can you expound on how gender or racial inequality also contributes to vulnerability in the region? Looking at the role of women, with your example, voodoo or memory, is there anything you want to expound on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to follow Dr. Perry's, you know, in conversation and speaking from my field side of Haiti, you know, I argue that these inequalities in Haiti and throughout the Caribbean are these material consequences of racial capitalism, of empire. And we have these inequalities that are distributed, concentrated disproportionately, you know, the populations who are living or resisting in the margins. And so particularly for Haiti, and thinking about Haiti's positionality within the political economic hierarchies of this global capitalist system, you know, I think about how these inequalities and risks, they're revealed in a variety of different ways, whether it's like food insecurity, the employment rate, building construction, unplanned development, disasters, crises, like all of these different inequalities are engendered in a variety of different ways, but it also exposes other things like pervasive trash or like sewage sanitation issues in Haiti. And so for me, it's so important to think through, you know, inequalities, racial inequalities, to think through white supremacy, anti-Blackness, because all of that, you know, forms this global apparatus driving climate change, ecological crises throughout the Caribbean. And particularly like for Haiti, where women, they make up, you know, the surplus population that fuels the informal economy, right? They don't have those safety nets. They don't have protection. Well, most of them don't, right? They may not have the safety nets during the, you know, ecological crises and disasters. And so, you know, I think through, you know, the question of memory, as you stated, you know, these inequalities are embedded, they're articulated in people's stories, their narratives, but I'm also thinking through how these inequalities, they are embodied through the body, right? So thinking about the embodiment of disaster risk and vulnerability, because when I talk to people in my research, they often talk about the health impacts of crises, the health impacts of flooding, and so how the climate change suffering flooding is experienced through the body. After flooding, people have to deal with hunger. They have to deal with mosquitoes and bacterial infections like cholera, being uncomfortable and dealing with emotional distress. So, the memory not only is articulated through people's voices, but it's also articulated through how the body is positioned within Haiti and how they experience the crises. And so it's really interesting to think through gender, to think through memory, to think through these inequalities, particularly through race, because it just, there's a lot of different ways in which these systems really distribute risk and inequalities in a variety of different ways across geographies, across the Caribbean.
And considering these different structural factors that result in inequality or vulnerabilities across the region, where do you think, or how do you think we can contribute to greater justice in geography? Where should we be pushing the narrative forward? What more work needs to be done, or what should we be focusing on to build resilience in the region?
I also want to sort of highlight the fact that Haiti is undergoing a current military occupation, and the invasion that is earmarked to be led by Kenya, and that has been sanctioned by the UN Security Council and these various bodies, contribute to the further dispossession of Haitians and for further incursion on Haitian sovereignty, right? So many, the United States sees Haiti almost as a plaything, and a space just to be to continue these kinds of injustices, right? So we saw during the occupation from 2004 to present that many Haitian women, for instance, were many of the so-called peacekeepers fathered children with Haitian women, right? And many of those children orphaned in large part because of some of the kinds of political and economic stability in Haiti. But also there is this ongoing ongoing issue of crisis as I come back to it, right? In Haiti is not special in the sense that this reverberates across the Caribbean in various kinds of ways, at various scales and in various contexts that this region continues to be bedeviled by these sort of forms of injustice. In terms of what do we do, I think this is always a tricky question, because I always try to, I never give policy recommendations, because I think policies are only useful. Policies are only useful when they're democratically determined, right, by people in those places that that need to deliberate on those issues and understand those issues well, right? And so one thing is, for me, a level of political education needs to happen across the region around our history, right? Our circumstances, right? How our history is connected to our present circumstances. And on the second, on the second level, I think the state, in a large part across, many of the Caribbean territories, has failed, right? I think that is a reality we have come to, in the sense that, not in the kind of racist sense and white supremacist sense of failed states that is often used in sort of the literature on governance, but around the question of understanding, one, what can we do as a region collectively, right? Through whether it's these institutions like CARICOM, which have not been doing very well because of a variety of reasons, but also what do we do in terms of community uplift, understanding at the community level, how do we, how do we understand how communities organize in relation to many of these kinds of so-called crises that they face. That is very important to recognize, that goes beyond the capacity of the state to actually address many of these issues. So I'm not great at offering any sort of policy ideas or anything like that, because I think they're useless from the point of view of an academic sitting in Los Angeles saying we need to talk about policy recommendations for Haiti or Antigua and Barbuda and so on. It's for me, yeah.
And you, Dr. Felima, what do you think? Where do you think we need to contribute greater to justice through the work in geographic? Where do you think we should be focusing on or moving forward?
I mean, I would echo the same. I think as researchers, for me, particularly as a trained anthropologist, I think what I can do is, offer justice and support through my writing, through sharing, these ecological narratives, these stories, and to share more about people's lived experiences during, crises and disasters. So I would say it's important to just qualify people's concerns and quantify them as well. So, through research, through writing, through surveying, I think that's important in terms of, justice work. And, I think also it's always important to kind of provide additional visibility, if we can as researchers. So whether that is, whatever coalition building is happening, across the Caribbean, I know some anthropologists are putting people in conversations because, we may have certain networks, and so putting people in conversation with other people. So I think, supporting efforts in that way is important. And also, again, more of this like applied advocacy where making sure these stories, people's concerns are, published. They are not only published, but published in a variety of different outlets, right? So not keeping the work just in academia, but thinking about public spaces in which people can have these conversations are also important as well.
I think it's also, if I could add, Kristina, it's also about supporting activities and struggles that are already happening on the ground, right? Whether it's through sort of, creating visibility around some of those struggles or amplifying some of those struggles, right? Because Haitians, for instance, know what they need. They've been demanding, for instance, a transitional government to address the political fallout from the assassination of the president in 2021, right? So, and there's been the kind of various initiatives that have been started by Haitian NGOs. NGOs. When I say NGOs, I mean those groups that have been started by Haitians, not those coming from outside, right? That have been calling for actions to be taken, and people have been ignoring them largely because the Biden administration and other entities, right, have decided they know what's best for Haiti. So it's about amplifying those efforts that are happening. So the Barbuda Privy Council case, but also, apart from the sort of legal recourse, it's, there's sort of very tangible things that you can do in support of those kinds of activities, right? We're in privileged spaces, right? In US academia, where we can amplify some of those things, where we can direct resources of support and various kinds of things to support those initiatives. And it's about really understanding what people want and not determining for ourselves what we think they need, right? And yeah.
Yeah. And the Barbudans, I think they had their case with the Privy Council on the 8th of November, I think it was last week, and we're waiting to hear a response. So we're hoping that the response will be favorable for the Barbudans on the ground. Given all that was discussed today, where can we follow the Barbuda case? I think the legal team that is taking up the support of the Barbudans would be the GLAN, GLAN, Global Leaders Advocacy Network. I'll type it in the chat, but yeah, they're getting support from a UK-based legal network. What advice would you give to students doing work in the Caribbean? Understanding all that was said before and, amplifying the works of those on the ground, reflecting or giving voice to those on the ground, considering publication in not only peer-reviewed journals, but other spaces where people can have access to. What advice would you give to persons in the field or students in the field doing work in the Caribbean? It's a tough one because everybody's like,
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I think, when I was a student, it was super important for me to find mentors, find my community within social sciences, and think in transdisciplinary terms. Because my background, before I was an anthropologist, I would say that I'm an Africana studies scholar with my, my BA in African American studies and my master's in Africana studies. And so really trying to find community within this space is important. And I think once that academic social network has expanded, I think that those folks will help you ask questions and think about different opportunities to pursue in the Caribbean to kind of advance this work. And so I think just for me, I would urge students to find their community, find their mentors, find who they can connect with, so that they can really ask intentional questions and think through different opportunities throughout the Caribbean, or even wherever they geographically located, to think through questions by finding their community.
Dr. Perry, what advice would you give?
I think it's one, approaching any community or any place with sensitivity, one, that you do not know everything. Right, I'm from the Caribbean and I study the Caribbean, but I don't know everything about the Caribbean, right? And I don't, so it's a level of humility that is required, that you're not coming in to, come and, hey, you're coming to help these people, right? This kind of paternalistic attitude towards people whom you think are suffering, right? They have agency, right? And it's about recognizing organic intellectuals in the community. Many of them know much better than many of us who are in academia about what those communities need and what those communities are facing and experiencing. And it's about approaching them with that particular understanding that people know their circumstances best and they're able to contribute to them. They just oftentimes are disempowered and disenfranchised from actually addressing their circumstances in a sort of a materially important way. So it's one, it's having an attitude and approach to the study of the Caribbean as places that are all, have organic organic intellectualism, but also there are, what we might call alternatives and approaches that people themselves have tried out at, various scales, be it at the community level, at the local level, and understanding those and amplifying those, as opposed to thinking that you're coming to solve a problem. I think that is how I approach communities, right? And not being extractive about it, right? Going to study this community and just leaving and completely having no connection to the community, and not investing in building those connections on a genuine and an authentic way, in a genuine and authentic way. So yeah, that's my sort of advice, right? 2 cents with respect to how do we think about and study the Caribbean.
Okay, so we have another question and it's coming in the chat. It says, Microsoft, it says, how can we understand repair and what is the politics of repair? I don't know who would prefer to take this question. Dr. Felima, would you like to start?
Can you repeat the question for me?
The question is, how can we understand repair and what is the importance of a politics of repair?
So for me, I think through repair in terms of like a Black feminist theory, analytical lens. And so care, following Black feminism, thinking through environmental ethics, thinking through care politics, love politics. For me, that is being very intentional in terms of writing, in terms of advocacy, in terms of language, in how I write about Haiti specifically. And so following anthropologists or one of my mentors, Gina Athena Ulysse, talks about new narratives for Haiti, right? And, you know, thinking through Haiti in more intentional ways instead of Haitian exceptionalism or thinking about Haitians as being so resilient or superhuman or subhuman. It is through this environmental ethics of care. It's through a voodoo ethics of care, as Regina Jean-Charles talks about in her new book. And so it is, you know, really thinking through this intentionality, thinking about environmental futures, thinking about livable worlds. And again, from this care politics of love, of intentionality, of being very deliberate, thinking about coalition building, advocacy. And that requires really being intentional in the work that we do in terms of if it's anthropological work, right? If I'm in Haiti, you know, as Dr. Perry talked about in terms of like not being extractive, anthropology can be very parasitic, right? Where you are very much extracting materials, you're extracting stories, you're creating your book, you're creating your dissertation, and then that's it. And so just really being intentional about the work, I think, is important.
If I could as well, I think, I mean, I've been thinking about this around what I'm calling, you know, reparative ecologies. And I think there's a really interesting piece that Joanne Scott Lewis, who's a scholar on reparations and repair, has sort of written about relational repair as more than just sort of reparations, right? Reparations are those, you know, forms of redress that, you know, the perpetrators of harm and violence, you know, have, you know, it's targeting them for some form of redress, whether it be, you know, some form of monetary compensation, or more than that, the sort of institutional framework that, for instance, CARICOM Reparations Commission have put forward as a means to address reparations, right, for the harms of slavery and native genocide. It's about thinking about what are the gaps that communities, this is what I'm sort of thinking through as I write the book, what are the gaps that those forms of reparations do not fulfill, right? What are the gaps that this post-colonial liberal state does not address in relation to addressing the needs of communities, right? And those gaps have often always been fulfilled. And I'm thinking with people like Sylvia Winter, Catherine McKittrick, Aaron Kamugisha, and others who have written about the fact that communities in the Caribbean have always relied on each other in order to address these gaps which have not been fulfilled by the market, whether it's, you know, the global market or other forms of other institutional forms like the state. And they have always fulfilled those gaps, right? Whether it's be forming cooperatives around particular kinds of issues of sharing resources, right? In Haiti and in other places, we have the Kumbit, you know, which is a sort of relational community organized labor arrangement that is alternative to a sort of wage labor, right? So it's about thinking about how those activities and those efforts have continually formed, you know, solidarity in communities where the state and capitalism are unable to really address some of those needs of the community. And repair happens as a part of that, outside of, and this is where Joanne Scott Lewis talks about outside of reparations and outside of formal reparations from whether it's be colonial states or enslavers, etc.
Thank you. And I don't know if we have any other questions in the chat. Okay, I don't see any other questions, but I thought this was a really thought-provoking session as we started off by what brought you into geography and looking at some of the structural challenges that we have in the region that forces vulnerabilities, inequalities, and how it manifests itself. Oh, I see a new message. Oh, so this comment says, returning to a point from Dr. Felima's work, not many folks are really thinking seriously about voodoo and by extension Caribbean religions that have been demonized for so long. So what would the role of Caribbean religion, for example, voodoo, place in repair or in building resilience? Dr. Felima?
Yeah, I mean, Haitian voodoo is all about the relationship you have to the environment, right? To your surroundings, to other people, to community, right? And so it is thinking through solidarity. And so having that like voodoo ethic, having that spirituality, right, can provide additional ways in thinking about our future, to think about climate change, to think about ways in which we process ourselves and our bodies within our various spaces and connections to others, whether it's human or non-human. And so there are, threats to that, particularly in Haiti, where Haitian voodoo is not seen as a religion that is all about community and all about building with other people, right? Or, because it is, seen as demonic or et cetera, et cetera. And so, in ways in which we think about Caribbean spirituality is a way in which we think about solidarity and relationships and coalition building with other people. And so the ways in which we think about, what surrounds Haitian voodoo, whether it's through the Potomitan, which is that center post that, is a part of Haitian voodoo ceremonies, and how everything surrounds that Potomitan, if we can take that kind of understanding with ourselves, right, to think about what surrounds ourselves, how we're related to other people, right, we can kind of have different ways in thinking about our futures, protection, solidarity of other people, thinking about repair, thinking about care politics. And so I think in some work that I see, that spiritual component is different, or it's created as something else, and there's no kind of mention to Haitian voodoo or to other indigenous practices. And so that dependency that's found in Haitian voodoo, that's found in other Caribbean, religions is so important, right? That relational dependency that Gilmore talks about, right? It's so important in how we think about ourselves and our families and our communities, right, for future world making. So
Thank you. I see someone had their hand up. No, it went down. Okay, so on that note, I would like to thank both our panelists, Dr. Perry and Dr. Felima, for the very rich discussion that we had today. I don't know if either Dr. Perry or Dr. Felima would like to close with some closing remarks. No, Dr. Perry, no. Okay, so I want to thank you all for coming out to today's session on disasters, post-colonial crisis, and ecologies of repair. I'd like you, for all those, to keep in touch with us from the Caribbean Geography Specialty Group. You could follow us on Twitter, if you're not a member of us, on the AAG platform, as we continue with our sessions on tracing the contours of the Caribbean geography. We also have a newsletter. You can check it out. A lot's happening in the Caribbean. Come check us out. And thank you so much for your time. And do have a good rest of the afternoon, morning, or day, wherever you are.